Hello, everyone. Welcome. I am Nathaniel Stein, for those of you who don't know me already. I'm the curator of photography at the Cincinnati Art Museum. I want to thank you all for being here tonight. As you know, we're here to talk about Natural World, which I think more than the exhibition and book upstairs has been a year-long conversation in which 4 people followed related but different routes into a shared set of ideas. 2 of the people that I've been privileged to work with in creating Natural World are here with me at this table. At my far right is David Hartt, who is the visual artist whose body of work called The Garden is on view upstairs. David's work is exhibited and collected at institutions including the Whitney, the Getty, the Hammer, the Art Institute of Chicago, the Studio Museum in Harlem, the National Gallery of Canada, MoMA, and many others, as well as at galleries including David Nolan in New York, Thomas Schulte in Berlin, and Chicago's Corbett versus Dempsey, who are here with us tonight. And David is also associate professor in the Department of Fine Arts at the University of Pennsylvania. At my immediate right is Jason Allen-Paisant, who is the author of a powerful essay in the Natural World book. That essay is called Viewing Pleasures and Vantage Points, Uncanny Embodiments in a Jamaican Great House. Jason is a prolifically published poet, writer, and scholar. Among a number of his forthcoming titles, his book, Scanning the Bush, 6 Stories About Black Bodies in Landscape, will be published in 2024. And he is also associate professor of critical theory and creative writing at the University of Manchester. And we're grateful to you, Jason, for battling your jet lag and traveling from the UK to be with us tonight. Unfortunately, John Edmonds, who is the 4th and a very formative member of our collaboration, John is the artist responsible for the body of work upstairs called Father's Jewels, has been unable to join us tonight due to medical reasons, and I know many of you were looking forward to hearing from John. And I'll say, as 3 people who have been in conversation with him for over a year now, you were right to be looking forward to hearing from him. But we will really miss his voice tonight, but we're sending him our wishes for rest and recovery. I want to make one last depressing statement tonight. I hope this will be the last depressing statement that I make tonight, but I do want to acknowledge that we have a strong community connections here in Cincinnati to Florida, and I know a number of people who might usually be here with us tonight for an event like this are reeling from Hurricane Ian. I know I am worried about some folks in Fort Myers, so it's really helpful to be in your company and fellowship here. And finally, on that note of gratitude, I want to express my thanks and the museum's thanks to the Charles Riley III Foundation, and of course to Fotofocus for their generous sponsorship of Natural World, and for so graciously including this project in the 2022 Fotofocus Biennial. Thank you also to the Donald P. Soul Committee and to Fotofocus again for co-hosting this event with the museum tonight. And finally, our thanks go to the Andy Warhol Foundation for the Visual Arts for their lead sponsorship of the Natural World collaboration, exhibition, and book. That's a lot of important information, which you have now been received. It's been downloaded. Excellent. So let's ease into the conversation. I thought it might be helpful to provide people with a little bit of background. It can be tough to grapple with a project as large and complicated as this with having just had a brief opportunity to look at the work in the gallery. So I will say, I have been cogitating about this project for a long time, and I really jumped at the opportunity to do this work for the 2022 fall season. My first outreach was to David Hartt. David received an unexpected email from me, which stemmed from my long-term admiration for his work, but also my understanding of his work as already being very engaged with the issues that are sort of on the table in this project. So I have dug back in the email archive, and this will be a little bit of a blast from the past. In summer 2021, I wrote a long email to David in which I said about this project, the project, provisionally titled Natural World, aims to engage audiences in thought about the work that nature and the idea of naturalness do in art, society, and history. By nature and naturalness, I do mean landscape, but also other constructions such as race and gender. The breadth or specificity of what is in play would be shaped by the participating artists. And as I've imagined it, the project involves 2 artists creating and installing work in dialogue with objects selected from the museum's permanent collection. I also envision a publication in which we could expand on the conceptual work taking place in the gallery and where I and another writer would add our own perspectives to the themes of the project. And so the kind of punchline of this was, are you interested, and will you help me shape this project? So David, if we might just sort of kick it off by asking you to talk a little bit about how this invitation found you, what was intriguing about it, and how did it connect with thoughts that might already have been in your mind?
Thanks for that introduction and summary of the events that eventually ensued. I just want to take this opportunity to thank both you, Nathaniel, and Emily for an amazing experience, and the museum itself for being such wonderful collaborators across departments, across galleries. It is so invigorating to have an institution open itself up for this kind of analysis and this kind of, I think, playful engagement. And so to have, just thank you so much for the invitation, and to see that we were able to realize something which I feel is quite ambitious means a lot. In terms of the invitation, there's one other perhaps piece of background that for me is important, exciting, and perhaps you hinted at it as to why the idea resonated, and that's some research that I began about 4.5 years ago with my interest in the significant Duncanson paintings that are here in the collection. And so I reached out to Nathaniel and asked both for access as well as archival material. I also visited the Taft, these two museums being some of the best examples and the deepest examples of Duncanson's work. And so I responded to the research that I was able to do here with an exhibition that initially was shown at Corbett versus Dempsey Gallery in Chicago called The History's Old Black Joe, part of a larger kind of cycle of works, and it actually showed at the Hammer Museum last summer. But I was explicitly looking at Duncanson's work and what does it mean for a person of, a black person to look at the landscape as a genre, as a set of traditions, as a kind of unique set of propositions and connections to the land. And I explored that in that work, but I think it also demonstrated the way within which the work is research-based and could be responsive to a collection. And so when you worded so elegantly the invitation, it was already built on a set of inquiries that I was engaged with, and I saw it as an opportunity to really kind of expand and go deeper. And so I immediately, and the other thing too is that I have had the privilege of working on these kind of longer term cycles of works that are sometimes several years. And I was right about to start explicitly addressing the concept of landscape as it relates to an extension of the built environment, rather than perhaps the kind of conventions of nature that are typically associated with it. And so this was an opportunity to really begin to kind of dimensionalize what I meant by that statement.
Mm-hmm. And it's fantastic from a process perspective that you arrived in the project with so many ideas already sort of loaded and ready to sort of look for the connections in the collection and explore them. Do you want to share any thoughts on inviting John Edmonds into the project? And we took some time to discuss sort of how we're going to build this project out. Would you like to talk about that at all?
Yeah, I mean, again, you were so generous in terms of, usually when I work with curators, this is not exclusive, but usually they have a pretty fixed idea of what the theme of the exhibition is and who the participants will be. And so to really kind of get in at the ground floor and to begin that in a discursive way where we could kind of imagine where this might go together, that was really exciting. I had curated a show in 2017, I think, 2017, maybe it was later, 2019. Anyways, it was at David Nolan Gallery in New York called The Synthetic Moment. John saw it and wrote me a wonderful letter. I think in the same way as I tried to approach the gallery installation upstairs, it was looking across generations, across media, across different approaches of images of Black bodies. And I think that the associations that I was making between artists like Zoe Leonard and Christopher Williams with James Barner, who's in his 90s, and Kwame Braithwaite, who's also recently passed, but also a senior artist, was exciting. And it was exciting for John to see the possibilities of those connections happening outside of perhaps the orthodoxies of geography or taste or subject. And so he wrote me a wonderful letter, and we just got into conversation. And then as you made suggestions for other possible participants, you encouraged me to do the same. And John was quite literally at the top of both of our lists of people that we thought we could really imagine what this thing might become.
Yeah. Similarly, when I think I was the one that proposed Jason as to bring as a writer into the project, and I think when I shared the essay that I shared with you all was an immediate yes. Let's do this. So Jason, maybe to kind of turn that question to you a little bit. By the time we approached you, David and John were already committed to the project, so the narrative about the project had developed a little bit more. I think a few things had come to the surface, so a few things were sort of, again, front-loaded by the time we got in touch with you. One, I will say that there's a lot to unpack here, which I'm sure that we'll get into a little bit later in the conversation, but one, I think that we were making an intentional choice that all three of the external collaborators invited to occupy the museum platform with me are cisgender Black men. And we also sort of, I think, agreed and identified that it's not insignificant that I, as the curator of the project, am both white and a trans man. Our third sort of big point that we kind of had on the table is that all four of us are navigating very specific institutional and professional frameworks from our respective subject positions. And so we are all in different positions in relationship to our institutions, but similar in some ways. So again, there's a lot to unpack there around identity, perspective, institutions, society at large, and we can certainly return to that in a moment. But Jason, I did want to give you an opportunity to answer that question that I asked David, which is, looking back to that first outreach to you, what were some of the things that, we did not know each other at all? It was a very much a stranger email that made you think, oh yes, this sounds like a compelling thing to involve myself in.
Thank you. Nathaniel, first of all, I have to likewise say how enriching I found this experience, and to thank you for the vision you've had, the ambition of the project, and the journey that we've all been on. I must also add that the essay, your essay in the collection, has been, as somebody who's also done a written contribution, has been particularly, is one of the most stunning pieces of work that I've read in quite a while. When this email reached me, I thought, well, there were a lot of words that, there were a lot of words in the email. It was a lengthy email, but a very...
I do write a long email, as
yeah.
Many people here can attest.
But not one of those long ones that you're thinking, oh my God, how can I, scan this
some of those too.
To get the meat, to get the meat of the matter out of it. No, it was a kind of long email that, honestly, I was able to sink my teeth into. It was considered, and it really touched on a lot of the things that I was thinking about at the time, namely, what is this business? What is this thing called nature? What do we mean when we say nature? Is nature a sort of thing out there given and absolute, or is it socially constructed? What is, how do we think about social relationships with landscape? How do we think about our bodies in time, in landscape? And of course, you mentioned the essay that I had written, and I was pleased to see that the essay had traveled so far and had begun to speak to people in such interesting ways. So I seized. I received it as a welcomed opportunity to enter a different sort of conversation. Mm-hmm. Unlike David, I have never worked with curators before. I am a writer. And so the idea of, well, there are two things that I saw coming out of this. Is the possibility of speaking to different audiences, new audiences. The idea of feeding my own work, and I don't mean that in a selfish way. I really do mean it as the opportunity to work with visual artists and to, who mentioned the word today, pivot, to shift, to sort of interrogate my own vocabularies of thinking about landscape and nature and the things that we all think about, but to do that transversally with yourself, David, with John, and you, Nathaniel, as a curator. So it was that excitement of entering into a new way of working. The challenge immediately to my mind was, how am I going to work with the museum's collections from Leeds, which is where I live?
You found a way around that, which is you worked with a different collection.
I ended up working with a different collection, but up until then, it was a big question that I grappled with. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. That challenge of physical location and distance, and how to navigate that.
Right. Well, since we've kind of introduced a little bit about what you actually wrote about for your essay, why don't you help us kind of get on the map? People will not have had the opportunity to read the essay at this point. So, to put it in broad strokes, you ended up writing about an encounter with a different kind of collection, essentially a plantation in Jamaica, which is now a historic house museum. Probably the best way to kind of make a parallel between things that are here and there. Tell us a little bit about how that essay unfolded for you.
Yes, that's a really interesting way of putting it. A historic house museum. I'd never looked at it. In other words, your speaking about it as a collection was an enabling thing for me, helping me to see what I was effectively doing, which was submitting the great house and spaces like that to critique, because that's what the word collection evokes to my mind. It's sort of it's a different way of as soon as you use the word collection in reference to objects, they take on a different meaning. They become aesthetic objects. And so I visited this great house in April of this year with my family. We traveled from Leeds. I'm from Jamaica, as you can probably tell, and with my mother as well. So here we are in this great house in in Trelawney, Jamaica, near to Montego Bay. And this is sort of these spaces which are houses, stately houses, mansions built on slave plantations. That's what they are. They're the the houses of the masters, and here we are visiting it in it's become a tourist sort of attraction, and something cracked open in that moment. I think it was, first of all, the portraiture that I saw hanging on the wall, and I started to think that this is something that I'd find more at home in the London Portraiture Gallery, or in stately homes in England. But as I say in the essay, I think it sort of figures in a way, because the history of the English stately homes are almost always connected in some way to slavery and colonialism. But the visual field, the images, the image of the love seat of the piano, the furniture in the dining room, the ballroom, the chinaware, the silver, all of these things, the Georgian fretwork of the veranda, the wide open windows that I talk about in the essay. It struck me that the great house is very much a thing that is out of place. It's a European structure of feeling transported to a new world landscape of the West Indies, for instance, an environment in which a grotesque affair is happening, which is slavery, the enslavement of black bodies. In other words, this space of gentility, this aesthetic grandeur, and the excessive sort of show of wealth and power is happening, side by side with the horrors of slavery. And so that it calls out to the body. I think it solicits the body in a particular way, and one begins to think about how bodies occupy, for instance, how my body, as a descendant of slaves, black, Jamaican descendant of slaves, occupies a space which is, something which is both past and very much alive. Mm-hmm. And so it's that attempt to make sense of the body in a space which is it's a place of crimes. Mm-hmm. It's a place of crimes, but one which is marketed as a tourist attraction, mostly mm-hmm. for North American and European tourists. So there's all sorts of mm-hmm. intersections of time and embodiment.
So there's so many things that pull out of that, but I think I want to come back to the idea of the past and the present, because I think that's the idea of transiting things through time, I think, is important to all three of your work, and of course including John Edmonds here, even though he's not at the table. But another kind of turn I wanted to make from what you're saying there is when I'm hearing you speak, I'm hearing you saying you're having an encounter with this collection. You are, through your encounter with it, are coming to understand what it is and what it is actually doing in a new way, that is happening through an aesthetic experience, and that is allowing you, in a somewhat unruly moment of realization, to see what is actually happening there in terms of an inscription of sort of European history, ownership, et cetera, on a place, on a landscape, as it were. I think this might be an opportunity to turn to you, David, and talk about how those things, first of all, tell us more about your project, but also how there are points of correspondence there with what you are doing.
Well, as I mentioned earlier, I was thinking about how to address the genre of landscape, what it means to do so today, in a way that didn't feel anachronistic, and that didn't prioritize, as I said earlier, these kind of false dichotomies between, the man-made culture and nature, but rather to kind of think of it as a kind of fluid continuum and to describe everything as the built environment. I was reading an important kind of book that kind of helped orient me by an Ohio-based environmental philosopher, Stephen Vogel, who teaches at Denison University, and the book's called Thinking Like a Ma, in which he posits that nature doesn't exist and has never existed, and that we are better served by calling everything the built environment, and how that demands a kind of accountability and recognizes the reciprocity in everything that we do. So that was kind of foundational in terms of helping me think directionally where I wanted to go. As it relates to specific histories of representation, of imaging, of naming, I was thinking about early photography, 19th century, and how photography was instrumentalized by a number of different other practices, some of them kind of really just kind of coming into their own or being developed kind of concurrently. So if we think about, the fields of archaeology or anthropology or philology, how photography was being used as a kind of objective proof or recording of and documentation of how these artifacts kind of returned from the field, what context they were found in. And what we see is the kind of development of a specific set of aesthetic tools that actually function as scientific tools simultaneously. And a lot of those ideas became encoded within the history of photography and the way that we look and think about concepts of truth, concepts of representation, concepts of sight and non-sight. I was specifically looking at the French heliographic mission, which was a mid-19th century grouping of 5 French photographers, including Gustave Le Gray, Mestral, and importantly Baldus, which we have examples of up in the gallery. And so, because I was looking at these images and thinking about the kind of echo effects of what did it mean to look at the world in that manner, when I was invited by Nathaniel to begin looking at the collection, I immediately kind of gravitated and tried to understand, what kind of representations historically were already in place here in the collection. You made me aware of the work of the 2 Cincinnati photographers, Baker and Hunt, who are working concurrently with photographers from the heliographic mission. So it allowed me to kind of dimensionalize the research in a way that also accounted for the local, even though they were working in Egypt and in Rome. And that inspired me really to begin in the same way as I was thinking about Duncanson, what did it mean to go out into the world and record from his specific kind of positionality. I began to think about revisiting some of the sites that were documented in the heliographic mission work, as well as the Hunt and Baker. And so I used the opportunity to go to Rome. So all of the images that are in the gallery that I generated were all made in May of this year. And it was really about what would it mean to return to these sites, but with a lens perhaps on a different kind of mode of representation. It was very reactive, very kind of improvisational, but what began to kind of emerge was the way within which nature presented itself in the interstitial kind of spaces in a very kind of liminal way that neither directly acknowledged the kind of documentation that was being done by the heliographic mission, nor kind of falling into some of the kind of tropes of traditional landscape, but rather kind of tried to figure, based on the kind of insistence of what it was I was photographing, to demand a new kind of visuality. And that became really exciting and fertile territory for me to explore, that in many ways kind of asserts the contemporaneity of the images that I'm trying to make, but also acknowledges the legacy of representation that comes before it in an historical way.
I mean, in a very overly simplistic way, I mean, the descriptions of the world that you're talking about are different but connected, right? It's a connected process of inscribing through representation, through making a collection, through making a site, making a place, an idea not just that there are things there, but that there is a natural order to those things, right? There is a proper way for those things to be, and this is what we're describing here. And it seems to me that for you, your body, your experience in that place became this sort of lightning rod to undo that construction, whereas for you, and I'm going to put this in a flippant way, but I think the term weeds is a loaded term because it has a lot of value lodged in it around, do we want these things, who's in control of them, et cetera. But weeds, if you will, become sort of your lightning rod, which I realize is a reductive summary of what you're doing there, but I think it's an interesting latching on point for a lot of people in the gallery is an immediate recognition of this is not an image of Rome that I've ever seen before. This is not the way we're supposed to see Rome. This is not the way we see an interaction between the natural world and the built environment. What is going on here? And then it is, through that critical moment that you, in theory, hopefully, are able to turn to the image next to it, which is a historical image, and see, there were some motivations going on in the way that world was pictured. This might be a good time to talk about another thing that people, perhaps not at first, but after a moment in the gallery notice about your work, which is that those two very amazing, enormous photographic images in the gallery upstairs by David are actually tapestries, not photographic prints per se. Can you talk, and I'm sort of introducing this also because I know you have some things to say about the 18th century tapestry and the sort of time of leisure, but can you talk a little bit about some of the choices that you've made? Your choices are always intentional around what is the material, how is this thing fabricated? Can you talk a little bit about the tapestry?
Sure. I mean, I began exploring the idea of tapestries several years ago, and it came really out of the challenge of how do I present photographic images at a particular scale? I was really interested with the first tapestry that I made, trying to deal with the complexity and the authority of history painting. What does it mean to present an image at that scale? What kind of authority does it project? And I was also really interested in how the dimension of time was utilized, where there could be multiple kind of temporalities within a work. And when you're confronted with a smaller work, it's much more difficult to kind of pack in that information. And so, I realized what my ambition was, but every time I blew a photograph up, it would fail. It would fail because of quite literally the limitations of the technology. At a certain scale, photographs become pixels or grain. And I always found it really dissatisfying to approach an image and then not to have it continue to kind of yield a kind of visuality or materiality. I, just through research, realized that there were these processes out there, specifically with tapestries, that might allow me to kind of end run around the failures of photography. And so the first tapestry that I produced, I was satisfied that from a distance, it appears as though it's a photographic image, but then as you approach it, something else happens, something somatic happens, something haptic, happens, and you get drawn into the weave and the craft and obviously the materiality of it all. And so at all of these different scales, at all of these different proximities, the work continues to kind of function, that there isn't this kind of threshold that you reach that you kind of suddenly tumble over and it can't yield anymore. And it also started making me think about, well, what does it mean to work within this tradition? What's the history of tapestry? And this work, especially if you're upstairs, kind of facing the bust of Rousseau, the image on the left of the kind of field of acanthus plants. One of the things that I was also addressing, and especially within the history of landscape, is the history of verdure tapestries. So tapestries specifically relating to the depiction of the landscape and of flora. It's a kind of magical realism avant la lettre, because in many ways the plants that are depicted within the verdures are hybrids or mutants. They're usually the flowers from one plant, the stalks from another, the leaves from another. And so there are these kind of beautiful kind of fictions that are totally ruled by the kind of aesthetic ambitions of the artist. What does it mean to make photographs, and how do we create a kind of alienation from the kind of built environment or nature that we typically understand? And so there were a couple of things that I was playing with that allowed me to kind of also create that alienating effect, whether it was the scale itself or the coloration, the use of flash, use of soft focus or shallower depth of field. All of those things kind of produce the same kind of illusory space that I was interested in with verdures.
Mm-hmm. So one of the things that is going on there, for me, and it is going on in many of your works in the gallery, is this, again, transiting through time, right? Something that is something from before becomes something that is happening now, and there's a transformation involved in that is actually very important. You noticed, or you shared with me earlier today, that one of the things that comes up for you when looking at the 18th century tapestry is that it enters you into this idea of a different sort of time frame, a time of, as you put it, leisure or gentility. Yeah. And I think, again, John is not here, but that's a very important part of John's work also, is entering us into a different time space for him, where things seem suspended and all things are present at once. We're not in the sort of temporal flow of daily life, but somewhere else, another place where what he's photographing and speaking about can exist. There's also, David, in your gallery as well as in John's, some interesting play going on with the way that you've chosen to present some of the work. So in using furniture, which those of us who are more familiar with museums will recognize as storage furniture. So the types of metallic screens and such that we store artwork on behind the scenes at the museum, not in the gallery usually. That was obviously a very intentional and conscious choice on your part to do that. And that is another kind of transiting things through time and place, a recontextualization that is very important. Do you want to talk a little bit about time and the idea of this time of leisure and gentility, and then you might want to make some comments about that if you wish.
I'm very taken with thinking about leisure, particularly as a kind of a way of being in time, a way of using time, which is not a category that's accessible to everybody, mm-hmm. and it's not accessible in the same way to everybody. So I'm very fascinated by leisure as a political category, and needless to say, it's something that's highlighted in the aesthetics of the promenade or the lunch, sort of the déjeuner on the déjeuner sur l'herbe, sort of that kind of slowness that's afforded that's available to the nobility and to those who have wealth and power.
Slowness, but also it's predicated on a particular and imagined relationship with nature.
Exactly, right? I agree. And you touched on, I think both of you said something that sort of opened up a chamber in my mind around dreaming or some sort of creation of an alternative reality. I think probably you were characterizing John's work as doing something of the sort. I think inhabiting, bending time in a way is perhaps a reclamation that we do in order to see our bodies differently. Sort of a kind of legerdemain that we do in order to shift our minds and to position ourselves in, for instance, leisure, which is a category denied perhaps to people from a certain milieu. That's a thing that I was moved by when I stood on that veranda, which I write about in the essay, Veranda of the Great House. And I'm fascinated by verandas because I'm fascinated by their scale, the sort of the broad verandas and the kind of statement that they make about scale and the power of viewing and sort of the pleasure of viewing. As it happens, the great house that I write about, most great houses in Jamaica tower above the sea. They have a view onto the sea and sort of like an almost panoramic view of the land below. So I think, and what I wanted to do, what I did, I wanted to photograph myself in an owner's stance. I thought, what would it be if I photographed myself or had myself photographed in the stance of the owner, in the stance of the one who has the right, who belongs here.
Right.
Sort of
So, Jason, in my view, this was your gallery intervention, right?
It was,
in a sense.
I thought of it as,
It
some
is,
kind of
absolutely.
intervention. And I also thought I thought it might be the beginning. I thought it was the beginning of a project, in which I would continually try to embody that stance.
Right.
The question was, what if I could become a planter for a moment?
Right.
What does that embodiment feel like? So I think that's why I talk about the gestures that we do, that to bend, to kind of create a kink in time, to kind of inhabit.
It's opening a gap.
To open a gap, perhaps, is a good way of to open the course of time, to reposition ourselves.
Right. Please.
It seems like a good point to jump in. I mean, the way I think about, space and time, there's a politics to it, right? So what does it mean to make space? And how does that result in making time? And so what does it mean to occupy space? It's something that I encourage my students to think about, to be in the moment, to recognize what kinds of agency they have in terms of occupying the space that they're in, or to make work that occupies space. And the potentialities of making space and making time in terms of the engagement with the work. But I think specifically, it's important to understand that, and this is for me one of the kind of core metaphors of using the garden as a title, is the idea that in the same way as I mentioned, the built environment is everything. It's all socially constructed as well. And so the idea of the garden, which is a social construct, being a kind of boundless space, one that, and then the attempt of the work is perhaps to foreground citizens that are participating in it, but just in a way that we don't acknowledge, right? So what does it mean to shift perspective to acknowledge their participation? And I think it also speaks to my inclusion of the bust of Rousseau, and so the social contract as an aspect within which we understand our kind of shared citizenry, and the concept of the sovereign, not articulating or privileging one point of view over another, but recognizing that its health and manifestation is totally contingent on the participation of every living thing. And so what are the politics of that, and what kind of time is presented when we begin to acknowledge macro time, micro time? I think I used a Stephen Wright joke as an explanation. early on when I was talking about the idea of the garden and some of the proposal that I just mentioned. Wright's joke is that he has the largest seashell collection in the world. He keeps it scattered on beaches. And I think of the same thing with my representations of the garden. And so it's an ongoing body of work which will recognize the modes within which it's distributed.
I do want to leave space and time for questions in the audience. I'm sure some have been percolating during this, but I did want to say also, David, it's from that thinking and our discussion of your thinking about those issues that sort of gave me the language that appears in some places upstairs about this idea of an enlarged shared conversation about the nature of the world, which I think ended up being a very important through note for the project. So thank you for that. Before we do open it up to questions, and this is your cue, where if you're doing the mental process, start doing it hard right now, so you can have the question ready to go. I of course want to thank David, Jason, and John in his absence for this hour and all that came before it. This has truly been one of the most generative experiences of my career, and I'm grateful not only for all the beautiful and powerful things that you all have created, but also for the ways that you have enlarged and enriched this conversation, and that we get to share that conversation with you all. So thank you. Thank you.